The gas station sat on a stretch of highway that seemed forgotten by time. The sun beat down relentlessly, making the air shimmer like a mirage. The pumps, chipped and weathered, had seen better days, and the small convenience store behind them looked like it survived only on the occasional passing traveler. Inside, an old ceiling fan turned lazily, as if too tired to do its job. Outside, a broken vending machine hummed faintly, a relic of busier times. Jake Tanner pulled his motorcycle into the lot, the rumble of the engine breaking the eerie silence. His bike wasn't flashy, but it was sturdy, a vintage piece of machinery that carried the kind of character only decades of care and miles on the road could give. He swung a leg over and dismounted, the creak of his worn leather jacket punctuating the stillness. His boots crunched on the gravel as he walked to the pump, his movements slow and deliberate, like a man in no rush. Jake was the kind of person who blended in wherever he went. His jacket, faded jeans, and calm demeanor made him seem unremarkable, just another drifter passing through. The lines on his face hinted at a life lived hard but not unkindly. His short cropped hair, peppered with gray, suggested experience, though he wasn't old. And his eyes, sharp, watchful, and a little weary, told a story he wasn't inclined to share. For Jake, this was supposed to be nothing more than a routine stop. He didn't need much, a full tank of gas, a bottle of water, and a moment to stretch his legs before hitting the road again. The highway ahead promised solitude, the kind Jake had grown to prefer. There were no obligations out there, no expectations, no one to demand more than he was willing to give. It was just him, his bike, and the open road. As he filled the tank, Jake let his gaze wander. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, flanked by dry, cracked earth and the occasional scrubby bush. A lone tumbleweed rolled lazily across the road, pushed along by a whisper of wind. Overhead, the sky was a brilliant blue, unbroken except for a few wispy clouds that seemed in no hurry to move. It was the kind of day that seemed peaceful if you ignored the oppressive heat and the sense of isolation. Jake didn't mind the isolation. He preferred it. Crowds, noise, and unnecessary conversations didn't suit him. He'd seen too much, done too much, to care for small talk. Most people would look at him and see nothing special, just another quiet man passing through. That's how Jake liked it. Better to let people underestimate him. Better they think he's ordinary. But Jake Tanner was far from ordinary. His hands, steady as they worked the pump, bore the scars of a life spent fighting battles most people couldn't imagine. The knuckles were rough, calloused, and weathered. They were hands that had built things and destroyed things, hands that had held weapons and offered comfort, hands that had saved lives and taken them. But to anyone watching, they were just the hands of a man filling up his bike. Jake's past wasn't something he advertised. There was no need. What was behind him didn't define who he was now, not entirely, at least. But it did shape him. It gave him the quiet strength, the unshakable calm, that made him who he was today. And it gave him the ability to face whatever came his way, no matter how unexpected. Today, something unexpected was about to come his way. As Jake finished filling the tank, he glanced toward the small convenience store. Through the glass, he could see the young clerk behind the counter. A teenager, probably no older than 19, with a nervous energy about him. The kid kept glancing toward the horizon, as if expecting trouble. Jake noticed things like that. He didn't mean to, it was just how his mind worked. Years of training and experience had taught him to read people, to pick up on the small details others missed. Jake screwed the cap back onto the tank and leaned against his bike for a moment, letting the stillness settle over him. He took a swig from the water bottle he'd pulled from his saddlebag and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. The heat was relentless, but it didn't bother him much. He'd endured worse conditions in places far less forgiving than this stretch of highway. As he stood there, the faint sound of engines reached his ears. Jake's head turned slightly, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the distant noise. It started as a low rumble, almost indistinguishable from the hum of the vending machine. But it grew louder, sharper, until it was unmistakable, the roar of motorcycles. Jake didn't move, didn't react. He simply watched the horizon, waiting. The first bike came into view, a sleek, black Harley glinting in the sunlight. 3 more followed, each one a little louder, a little flashier, than the last. The riders were a stark contrast to Jake, loud, brash, and clearly out to make a statement. They wore leather vests adorned with patches, their arms inked with tattoos that declared their allegiance to a brotherhood Jake didn't care to name. The bikes pulled into the gas station, their engines echoing off the metal awning. The riders dismounted, their laughter and shouts breaking the quiet like a glass shattering on tile. They didn't notice Jake at first, too busy with their own bravado. But Jake noticed them. He noticed everything, the way they carried themselves, the way they talked, the way they scanned their surroundings like predators looking for prey. Jake had seen their kind before. He knew what they were about. And he had a feeling this peaceful little stop was about to get complicated. He didn't flinch, didn't change his stance. He simply waited, his expression calm, his body language relaxed. He wasn't looking for trouble. But if trouble came, he'd be ready. He always was. To the world, Jake Tanner was just another biker passing through. A quiet man with a vintage motorcycle and a preference for solitude. But beneath that quiet exterior was something the world didn't know. Something Jake rarely showed. And today, for better or worse, someone was about to find out. Jake Tanner didn't make a move as the bikers dismounted. He didn't need to. Staying still, blending in, and assessing the situation was something he was good at. The years had taught him patience, a skill often underestimated in situations like this. The 4 men who had arrived weren't just passing through. Jake could tell by their body language. They moved with a swagger, the kind that came from confidence born of being unchecked for too long. Each step they took carried the weight of someone used to getting their way. Their laughter echoed through the empty gas station, loud and deliberate, as if they were marking their territory. One of the men, a tall, broad figure with a skull and snake tattoo coiled around his neck, seemed to be the leader. His boots crunched on the gravel as he surveyed the area, his eyes landing on the gas station clerk for a moment before shifting to Jake. The tattooed man tilted his head, smirking slightly, but didn't approach right away. Instead, he spoke loudly to his crew. "Nice little place, huh? Real quiet." His voice was rough, the kind that carried authority among the group. "Too quiet?" Jake caught the glance, but he didn't react. He kept his gaze fixed on his bike, wiping the tank with a cloth he'd pulled from his saddlebag. It was a small movement, deliberate and calm, but it served a purpose. Jake wasn't ignoring them, he was observing. The other 3 bikers fanned out, their eyes scanning the area. One leaned against a pump, pulling out a cigarette and lighting it with a practiced flick of his lighter. Another walked toward the vending machine, kicking it lightly with his boot before chuckling to himself. The third simply stood there, arms crossed, a menacing grin on his face as he stared at Jake. "Hey, man," the grinning one called out, taking a step closer. "Nice bike. Real classic. Where'd you get it?" Jake didn't look up right away. He finished wiping the tank, folded the cloth neatly, and placed it back in his saddlebag. Then he straightened, his eyes meeting the man's with a steady, unflinching gaze. "Picked it up a long time ago," Jake replied, his tone even, almost casual. The man chuckled, but it wasn't friendly. "Bet it's got some good stories, huh? Bet you've got some good stories." Jake shrugged slightly, keeping his posture relaxed. "Just a bike," he said simply. The leader, still watching from a few feet away, raised an eyebrow at Jake's calm demeanor. He took a step forward, his boots crunching loudly. "A bike like that isn't just a bike," he said, his voice carrying a hint of challenge. Takes a lot of care. A lot of pride. Am I right? Jake turned his head slightly, meeting the leader's gaze. Guess you could say that, he replied, his tone still neutral. The leader smirked again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. He looked at his crew, then back at Jake. Well, here's the thing. We've got a lot of pride too. Pride in our bikes, pride in our collection. Jake didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let his eyes shift briefly to the gas station clerk, who was now peering nervously from behind the counter. The kid's face was pale, his hand hovering near the phone. Jake didn't need to see more to understand the clerk's fear. He'd seen that look before, in places far removed from this dusty highway. The leader stepped closer, his tone shifting to something more direct. How about you let us take that beauty off your hands? You know, for the collection. Jake's jaw tightened, but only slightly. It was a subtle reaction, almost imperceptible. Not for sale, he said quietly, his voice firm. The other bikers laughed, the sound harsh and grating in the still air. The leader, however, didn't laugh. His smirk faded, replaced by a hard, calculating look. Didn't sound like I was asking, he said, his tone dropping. Jake met the man's gaze again, his expression unchanged. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes, a quiet defiance that seemed to unsettle the leader for a moment. The air grew heavier, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The bikers shifted slightly, their laughter fading as they realized Jake wasn't reacting the way most people did. There was no fear, no stammering excuses, no desperate attempts to appease them. Just calm, unwavering confidence. Look, old-timer, one of the other bikers chimed in, his voice dripping with mockery. We're trying to be nice here. Don't make us regret it. Jake tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. Nice, huh, he said, his tone laced with a hint of dry humor. Funny way of showing it. The leader's lips curled into a snarl. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who looked as unassuming as Jake. You've got some nerve, don't you, he growled, taking another step closer. Jake didn't move. He stayed rooted in place, his body relaxed but ready. His gaze never wavered, and his voice didn't rise. I've seen worse, he said simply. The leader froze for a moment, taken aback by the quiet confidence in Jake's words. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He didn't know who Jake Tanner was, but something about the man's presence made him hesitate. The moment passed quickly. The leader shook it off, his bravado returning as he barked a laugh. All right, boys, he said, turning to his crew. Looks like we've got ourselves a stubborn one. Guess we. The leader's grin faltered for a split second, but he quickly masked it with bravado. Tough guy, huh, he said, his voice rising with mock amusement. He gestured to his crew, motioning them to spread out. The other three bikers moved into position, creating a loose semicircle around Jake, their boots crunching on the gravel as they eyed him like wolves cornering prey. Jake stayed calm, his hands resting lightly at his sides. His eyes flicked between the men, assessing. He noted the way one of them kept adjusting his leather gloves, the way another's fingers twitched near the chain hanging from his belt. These weren't just bikers looking for trouble, they were used to getting their way, used to people folding under the weight of their intimidation. But Jake Tanner wasn't most people. The leader stepped closer, invading Jake's personal space. He was taller, broader, and clearly relished the advantage of size. Last chance, old man, he said, his tone dripping with menace. You hand over the bike, or we'll take it. And trust me, you don't want us to take it. Jake's lips pressed into a thin line. His calm gaze didn't waver, but his voice carried an edge when he finally spoke. You don't want this fight. The tension in the air thickened, heavy and oppressive. The gas station clerk, still hiding behind the counter, peeked out just enough to see what was happening. His face was pale, his hands gripping the edge of the counter as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. One of the bikers, the smallest of the group but still formidable, barked a laugh. Listen to this guy. He thinks he's some kind of action hero. He leaned closer, sneering at Jake. You're outnumbered, old man. What are you gonna do, huh? Call the cops. Jake didn't reply. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any threat he could have voiced. The leader, growing impatient, grabbed the front of Jake's jacket, pulling him closer. The move was meant to intimidate, but Jake didn't resist. He let the man drag him forward, his expression unchanging. It wasn't submission, it was calculation. Jake was giving the man just enough rope to hang himself. I don't think you're listening, the leader snarled, his face inches from Jake's. This bike? It's ours now. And if you're smart, you'll walk away before we make you crawl. Jake tilted his head slightly, his gaze locking onto the leader's. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried a weight that silenced the surrounding noise. You've already made your first mistake. The leader blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Oh yeah? And what's that? Jake's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. You underestimated me. Before the leader could react, Jake moved. His hand shot up, gripping the wrist of the hand holding his jacket. With a swift, practiced motion, he twisted, forcing the leader's arm into an unnatural angle. The man let out a startled yell, releasing Jake as he stumbled back. The other bikers froze, their confidence faltering. Jake stepped back, his stance shifting into something that was no longer casual. He stood balanced, centered, his body language exuding the kind of quiet authority that couldn't be faked. I told you, Jake said evenly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the group. You don't want this fight. The leader recovered quickly, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment. Get him, he barked, his voice a command laced with fury. The smallest biker lunged first, swinging the heavy chain from his belt in a wide arc. Jake sidestepped smoothly, his movements economical and precise. The chain whipped past harmlessly, and before the man could recover, Jake's fist connected with his stomach in a perfectly placed strike. The biker doubled over, gasping for air, and Jake finished him with a quick elbow to the back of the head. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The remaining two bikers hesitated, their bravado replaced by uncertainty. They exchanged a glance, then rushed Jake together, hoping their combined strength would overwhelm him. Jake didn't hesitate. He stepped forward to meet them, his movements fluid and efficient. He blocked one man's punch with his forearm, countering with a swift knee to the ribs that sent the biker staggering. The second man swung a crude punch, but Jake ducked under it, delivering a sharp jab to the man's jaw. The crack of impact echoed in the air as the biker stumbled back, dazed. The leader watched in stunned silence as his crew fell one by one. His hands balled into fists, his earlier arrogance replaced by a flicker of doubt. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They were the ones who ran the show, the ones who took what they wanted without consequence. But now, this quiet drifter was dismantling them like it was nothing. The last standing biker, clutching his side, tried to rally. He picked up a length of metal pipe from the ground, swinging it wildly in Jake's direction. Jake stepped back, his movements calculated, waiting for the perfect moment. When the man overextended, Jake caught the pipe mid-swing, wrenching it from his grasp with a twist that sent the biker sprawling. Jake tossed the pipe aside and turned his attention to the leader, who was now the only one left standing. The man's confidence had drained away, replaced by fear thinly masked as rage. Your turn, Jake said, his voice calm but unmistakably commanding. The leader clenched his fists, his knuckles white, but he didn't move. His eyes darted to his fallen crew, then back to Jake. He seemed to weigh his options, the realization sinking in that he was outmatched. Jake took a step forward, and the leader took an involuntary step back. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and the man who had strutted into the gas station full of arrogance now looked like a cornered animal. "I'll give you one chance," Jake said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Get on your bikes, take your friends, and leave. Don't come back." For a moment, it seemed like the leader might argue, but the look in Jake's eyes stopped him. There was something there, something cold and unyielding, forged by a life of facing far worse than this. The leader swallowed hard, his bravado finally crumbling. Without a word, he turned and gestured for his crew to get up. The conscious ones scrambled to their feet, dragging their unconscious companion with them. They climbed onto their bikes, battered and humiliated, and started their engines. As the roar of their Harleys faded into the distance, Jake turned back to his motorcycle. He adjusted his jacket, checked his bike, and acted as if nothing had happened. The gas station clerk emerged slowly from behind the counter, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. Who are you?" the kid stammered, his voice shaking. Jake glanced at him, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Just a guy passing through," he said. With that, he mounted his bike, started the engine, and rode off into the horizon, leaving behind a story the kid would likely tell for years to come. The gas station returned to an eerie stillness, the rumble of the bikers' engines fading into the distance. The air, thick with the scent of gasoline and hot asphalt, hung heavy with the weight of what had just occurred. Jake Tanner didn't linger. He adjusted his gloves, glanced once more at the trembling gas station clerk, and gave the kid a faint nod before straddling his bike. But just as he reached for the ignition, a low growl of engines crept back into earshot. Jake's hand froze. The unmistakable sound of Harleys wasn't retreating, it was getting louder. The bikers hadn't left for good. They were regrouping. Jake sighed, his expression remaining calm. He wasn't surprised. Men like that didn't take kindly to humiliation, especially not in front of their own. If they had returned, it meant only one thing: they had backup. The gas station clerk darted back inside, peering nervously through the grimy window. His pale face was pressed against the glass, eyes wide with fear. "They're coming back," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Jake turned his head toward the highway. The shimmering horizon wavered in the heat, but the unmistakable figures of motorcycles appeared, growing larger with each passing second. This time, there were more 6, maybe 7 riders, their formation tighter and more purposeful. Among them was the leader from before, now flanked by 2 men nearly as large as he was. Jake's lips tightened into a thin line. This wasn't a random power play anymore. It was an escalation. The convoy roared into the lot, dust billowing in their wake. Engines idled as the riders dismounted one by one, their boots crunching the gravel like a war drum. The leader strode forward, his chest puffed out, his bruised ego demanding restitution. Behind him, the new arrivals fanned out a mix of muscle, leather, and menace. "Thought you could embarrass me," the leader barked, pointing a finger at Jake. His voice was louder now, fueled by rage and the false confidence of his reinforcements. "Big mistake, old man." Jake didn't respond immediately. He swung his leg over his bike, planting his feet firmly on the ground. His movements were deliberate, controlled. Standing tall, he faced the growing crowd of bikers with the same steady gaze that had unsettled them earlier. "I gave you a chance to walk away," Jake said calmly, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You should have taken it." The leader let out a harsh laugh, though it lacked conviction. "Walk away? You think you scare us? You're alone, and we've got numbers now." Jake tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the group. "Numbers, sure. But numbers didn't always win. He'd seen it time and again in places far worse than this. Behind him, the gas station clerk cracked the door open, his voice trembling as he called out, "Hey, mister, maybe you should just leave. They're not worth it." Jake glanced over his shoulder, offering the kid a reassuring look. "Don't worry. I've got this." The clerk hesitated, torn between retreating to safety and watching the scene unfold. Finally, he ducked back inside, slamming the door shut and bolting it for good measure. Jake turned back to the bikers, his focus sharpening. The group was inching closer, their confidence buoyed by their numbers. The leader smirked, mistaking Jake's silence for hesitation. "Boys," the leader called out, gesturing toward Jake, "why don't we show our new friend here how things work around these parts?" The first biker to step forward was one of the new arrivals, a tall, burly man with arms as thick as tree trunks and a face twisted into a permanent scowl. He cracked his knuckles as he approached, clearly eager to make a point. "Let's see what you've got, Grandpa," he sneered. Jake didn't wait for the man to make the first move. With a speed and precision that caught everyone off guard, he stepped forward, grabbed the man's arm mid-swing, and twisted. The biker let out a howl of pain as Jake's boot connected with the back of his knee, sending him crashing to the ground. Jake released him with a shove, leaving him sprawled in the dirt. The group froze, the air thick with disbelief. The ease with which Jake had handled the burly man sent a ripple of unease through the bikers. This wasn't what they'd expected. The leader's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "What are you all standing around for?" he barked. "Get him." Two more bikers charged in unison, their movements less coordinated but fueled by aggression. Jake sidestepped the first, grabbing his jacket and using his momentum to slam him into the side of a gas pump. The second swung a heavy wrench, but Jake ducked, delivering a sharp uppercut to the man's jaw that sent him stumbling backward. The fight unfolded like a well-rehearsed dance, each of Jake's movements deliberate and efficient. He didn't waste energy on showy techniques or unnecessary strikes. Every motion was calculated to neutralize his opponents as quickly as possible. The remaining bikers hesitated, their confidence shaken. The leader, now visibly furious, clenched his fists and stepped forward. "You think you're tough," he snarled. "Let's see how tough you are against me." Jake squared his shoulders, his expression unchanging. "I've seen tougher," he said, his tone flat but cutting. The leader charged, his fists swinging wildly. He was stronger than the others, but his anger made him sloppy. Jake dodged the first punch, blocking the second with his forearm before countering with a swift jab to the man's ribs. The leader grunted, stumbling back but quickly recovering. "You're gonna regret this," he spat, lunging again. Jake met him head-on, their movements a blur of strikes and counters. Despite the leader's size and strength, Jake's experience and precision gave him the upper hand. A well-placed knee to the stomach followed by an elbow to the temple sent the leader sprawling to the ground. Jake stood over him, his breathing steady, his posture relaxed. "Stay down," he said, his voice calm but commanding. The leader groaned, clutching his side, but he didn't get up. The remaining bikers, now thoroughly demoralized, began to back away. Their earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by a palpable fear of the man they'd underestimated. Jake scanned the group, his gaze sweeping over each of them. "Take your bikes," he said evenly. "And don't come back." The bikers didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled to their feet, helping the leader as they hurried back to their motorcycles. Engines roared to life, and one by one, they peeled out of the lot, disappearing down the highway. Jake watched them go, his expression unreadable. Only when the last of the Harleys was out of sight did he turn back to his own bike. The gas station clerk, emboldened by the retreat, stepped cautiously outside. Are they gone?" the kid asked, his voice still shaky. Jake nodded. For now. The clerk stared at him, a mixture of awe and disbelief etched across his face. Who are you, man? You're not just some biker, are you? Jake didn't answer right away. He swung a leg over his bike, adjusted his helmet, and started the engine. Just a guy passing through, he said simply. And with that, he rolled out of the gas station, leaving behind nothing but dust and a story the clerk would never forget. The gas station lot became a chaotic blur of fists, grunts, and dust. Jake moved like a shadow, fluid and deliberate, his every action packed with purpose. He sidestepped punches, deflected kicks, and dismantled the bikers' attacks with an ease that made them look amateurish. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed like luck. To those who understood combat, it was art. The leader scrambled to his feet, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and disbelief. What the hell are you, man? Some kind of ninja, he barked, rubbing his jaw where Jake's elbow had landed moments earlier. Jake didn't respond immediately. Instead, he blocked another biker's clumsy swing and countered with a sharp jab to the man's solar plexus. The attacker doubled over, gasping for air, before collapsing to the ground. Jake stepped back, his gaze steady as he surveyed the remaining men. I'm just a guy who doesn't like bullies, he said at last, his voice low and calm. But there was more to Jake than he was letting on, and the bikers were starting to realize it. The way he anticipated their moves, the way he stayed completely composed even as the odds stacked against him, it wasn't normal. It wasn't just experience. There was something else, something deeper, in the way he fought. The bikers regrouped, forming a loose circle around Jake. Their earlier confidence was gone, replaced by hesitation. They exchanged uneasy glances, each one hoping someone else would make the next move. The leader snarled, trying to regain control of the situation. Don't just stand there, he shouted. Take him down. Two bikers charged simultaneously, hoping to overwhelm Jake with sheer numbers. Jake didn't flinch. He shifted his weight, using one attacker's momentum to send him crashing into the other. The sound of bodies hitting the gravel echoed across the lot, followed by groans of pain. Another biker, armed with a chain, swung wildly at Jake. The chain whistled through the air, but Jake was faster. He caught the chain mid-swing, yanked it free, and used it to trip the man in one swift motion. The biker hit the ground hard, and Jake tossed the chain aside like it was nothing. The remaining men hesitated, their bravado crumbling. One of them muttered, "This guy's not normal." "You're damn right he's not normal," another said, eyeing Jake like he was a predator circling its prey. The leader wasn't ready to back down. His pride wouldn't let him. He wiped a trickle of blood from his lip and took a step forward, pointing a shaking finger at Jake. "You're gonna regret this, old man," he spat. "I don't know who you think you are, but—" "You don't need to know who I am," Jake interrupted, his tone colder now. "Just know you picked the wrong fight." There was something in his voice, something that made even the leader falter. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact. Jake wasn't boasting, wasn't posturing. He was simply stating the truth. As the bikers struggled to their feet, bruised and battered, one of them noticed something, a small patch sewn onto the inside of Jake's leather jacket. It was faded and worn, but the words were still legible: Special Forces. The biker's eyes widened. "Hey, boss," he said, his voice shaking. "You see that? His jacket, he's military. Special Forces." The leader glanced at the patch, and his expression shifted. For the first time, there was fear in his eyes. "Special Forces," he repeated, his voice cracking slightly. Jake didn't acknowledge the comment. He didn't need to. His actions had already said enough. The gas station clerk, who had been watching from the safety of the store, stepped closer to the window, squinting at the scene outside. He had no idea what Special Forces meant, but he could tell it was significant. The bikers' demeanor had changed completely. They weren't just cautious now, they were scared. One of the younger bikers whispered, "Man, this guy's probably killed people." "More like a lot of people," another muttered. "Look at the way he moves. This isn't some bar brawler. He's trained." The leader shook his head, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. "So what?" he said, louder than necessary. "He's just one guy. There's still more of us." But even he didn't sound convinced anymore. Jake took a slow step forward, his presence alone enough to make the group retreat slightly. "You've got two choices," he said evenly. "You can leave now and never come back. Or," he didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. The leader clenched his fists, his jaw tight. For a moment, it looked like he might push his luck. But then he glanced at his men, bruised, battered, and visibly terrified, and made the smarter choice. "Let's go," he muttered, turning toward his bike. The other bikers didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled to their feet, limping back to their motorcycles. Engines roared to life, and within moments, the group was gone, disappearing down the highway like a bad memory. Jake watched them go, his expression unreadable. He didn't relax until the last of the tail lights vanished into the distance. Only then did he let out a quiet sigh and turn back to his bike. The gas station clerk pushed open the door cautiously, his eyes darting around the empty lot. "Are they gone?" he asked hesitantly. "For now," Jake replied, adjusting his gloves. The kid stepped closer, his face a mixture of awe and curiosity. "You're military, huh? Special forces? Is that why you're so, good at this?" Jake didn't answer right away. He swung a leg over his motorcycle, settling into the seat. "Used to be," he said finally. "A long time ago." The clerk frowned, clearly wanting to ask more questions, but Jake didn't give him the chance. He started the engine, the low rumble filling the silence. "Wait," the kid called out. "What's your name?" Jake glanced over his shoulder, his expression softening slightly. "Just call me Jake," he said. And with that, he pulled out of the lot, leaving the gas station and its nervous clerk behind. As he disappeared down the highway, the kid stood there, replaying the events in his mind. Jake Tanner wasn't just a drifter, and the kid knew it. He was someone with a past, someone who'd seen things, done things, that most people couldn't imagine. Back in the store, the clerk stared out the window for a long time, wondering who Jake really was and what kind of battles had shaped the man who had just saved his life. Jake's motorcycle hummed along the empty highway, the wind tugging at his jacket. The gas station encounter already felt like a distant memory. He didn't look back, he never did. Life had taught him that the past was a weight best left behind. But this time, it lingered in the back of his mind, the faces of those bikers, the panic in their eyes when they realized who they were dealing with. He could still hear the young clerk's question echoing in his head, "Special Forces?" It wasn't the first time someone had noticed the patch on his jacket, but it had been years since anyone asked about it. Jake had kept it not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the men he'd served with, the ones who didn't make it back, and the promises he'd sworn to keep. The highway stretched on, endless and unchanging, but Jake's thoughts were anything but calm. He had seen that look on the bikers' faces before, in combat zones, in enemy camps, in places where survival was measured in seconds. It wasn't the kind of fear that faded quickly. About 20 miles down the road, Jake spotted a diner. It was the kind of place that didn't ask questions, with a neon sign that buzzed faintly in the evening air. Jake parked his bike, stretched his legs, and stepped inside. The smell of coffee and fried food hit him immediately, a comforting contrast to the day's events. He slid into a booth near the back, keeping his back to the wall and a clear view of the door, a habit he'd never shaken. A waitress approached, her smile tired but genuine. "What can I get you?" "Just coffee," Jake said, his voice as steady as always. The waitress nodded and walked away, leaving Jake to his thoughts. He glanced around the diner. A trucker sat at the counter, sipping from a steaming mug. A couple in a corner booth shared a plate of fries. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. But Jake's instincts told him otherwise. As he sipped his coffee, the door swung open, and a group of men walked in. They weren't wearing biker vests, but their swagger and the way they scanned the room were unmistakable. Jake recognized them immediately: reinforcements. The leader from the gas station wasn't the type to let things go. Jake had embarrassed him in front of his crew, and now he was looking to even the score. The men spread out across the diner, pretending to look casual, but their eyes kept flicking toward Jake's booth. Jake placed his coffee cup down slowly, his movements deliberate. He wasn't surprised they always came back. What mattered now was how he handled it. One of the men, a burly figure with a shaved head, approached Jake's booth, leaning on the edge of the table. "Hey there," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Fancy running into you again." Jake didn't look up right away. He took another sip of his coffee, savoring the quiet moment. "Small world," he said finally, meeting the man's gaze with calm intensity. The man chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You embarrassed my friends back there. Boss doesn't take kindly to that." "Your boss should have picked better friends," Jake replied evenly. The man's smile faded, replaced by a scowl. "You've got a smart mouth for someone outnumbered." Jake's eyes flicked to the rest of the group. 4 of them, all big and mean looking. They weren't as cocky as the first crew, which meant they knew what Jake was capable of. That made them more dangerous. They wouldn't underestimate him. The burly man leaned closer. "You're gonna walk out that door, nice and quiet. We'll take your bike, and maybe we let you keep walking. Got it?" Jake tilted his head slightly, as if considering the offer. Then he stood up, slow and steady, his calm demeanor never wavering. He was a full head shorter than the man in front of him, but the way he carried himself made the size difference irrelevant. "I've got a counter offer," Jake said. "You leave now, and I don't break anything that'll take more than 6 weeks to heal." The man blinked, caught off guard by Jake's calm confidence. "You think you're funny," he growled. Jake didn't answer. Instead, he adjusted his jacket, revealing something beneath it: a glimpse of a tattoo on his forearm. It was simple, just a series of numbers and letters, but it made the man hesitate. He recognized it, a service number. "Military." "Boss didn't tell us you were one of those guys," the man muttered, stepping back slightly. "Now you know," Jake said. "And I'd suggest you think real hard about your next move." Before the man could respond, one of the others made his move. He lunged at Jake from the side, hoping to catch him off guard. But Jake was ready. He ducked, pivoted, and used the man's momentum against him, sending him crashing into a table. The diner erupted into chaos. The trucker at the counter grabbed his plate and bolted for the door. The couple in the corner shrieked and ducked under their booth. The waitress yelled something about calling the cops, but Jake wasn't paying attention. He was focused on the fight. The remaining 3 men closed in, their confidence bolstered by their numbers. Jake didn't wait for them to strike first. He grabbed a chair and used it to block a punch, then swung it into another attacker's legs, knocking him off balance. One of the men managed to grab Jake's arm, but he twisted free with a move that looked almost effortless. A second later, the man was on the ground, clutching his ribs. The burly leader was the last one standing. He looked around at his fallen comrades, then back at Jake. "You're gonna regret this," he spat, backing toward the door. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Jake stepped forward, his gaze like steel. "No," he said quietly. "You don't." The man hesitated for a moment, then turned and ran, leaving his friends behind. The diner fell silent. Jake stood there, breathing steadily, his eyes scanning the room for any remaining threats. When he was sure it was over, he relaxed slightly and turned back to his coffee, still miraculously upright on the table. The waitress peeked out from behind the counter. Are they gone?" she asked, her voice trembling. "For now," Jake said, sitting back down. He took another sip of his coffee, savoring the brief moment of peace. But he knew it wouldn't last. Men like the ones he'd just dealt with didn't give up easily. And their leader, the one with the skull and snake tattoo, wasn't going to let this slide. Jake glanced at the window, watching the horizon. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the diner lot. Trouble was coming. He could feel it. The leader stumbled backward, his wide eyes darting to his fallen crew. Fear replaced the arrogance that had fueled him earlier. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. Instead, he turned and motioned for his men to follow. Those who could still stand scrambled toward their bikes, dragging the others with them. Jake watched them go, his expression unreadable. He didn't move until the roar of their engines faded into the distance. Then, with a slow exhale, he turned back toward the gas station. The teenager behind the counter peeked out cautiously, his face pale and filled with awe. Are you okay?" the kid asked, his voice shaking. Jake gave a faint nod. "I'm fine. They won't bother you again." The kid hesitated, then asked the question that had been hanging in the air since the fight began. "Who are you? Like, really?" Jake's gaze softened for a moment. "Just someone who knows how to handle himself," he said. But even as he said it, the kid's curiosity didn't waver. Jake turned to his motorcycle, ready to leave, but something stopped him. A memory, sharp and vivid, flashed in his mind: faces of his old unit, voices calling out orders, and the weight of responsibility he had carried for so long. This wasn't just about defending himself. It was about sending a message, one he knew he couldn't run from. Jake's departure was delayed by an ominous realization. As he checked the fuel cap on his bike, he noticed something out of place: a faint, oily residue near the seat. His instincts flared to life. He crouched, running his hand along the underside of the bike, and found it, a small, crudely wired tracking device. "Amateurs," Jake muttered under his breath. The bikers weren't done with him. They had underestimated him once, but they were regrouping, likely calling for reinforcements. Jake knew the drill: he'd seen it before in operations overseas. They'd regroup, bring more men, and try to overwhelm him. This wasn't over. Jake removed the device carefully, then tossed it into a nearby trash can. If they were tracking him, he'd make sure they followed the wrong trail. His mind raced with strategies, and for the first time in years, he felt the old fire ignite within him: the mindset of a soldier preparing for battle. The next move wasn't about running, it was about setting the stage. Jake rode to a secluded spot off the highway, an abandoned construction site with enough open space to give him an advantage. He parked his bike strategically and surveyed the area, noting the high ground, possible cover, and escape routes. As night fell, he prepared. He pulled a duffel bag from his bike's compartment, unzipping it to reveal a collection of tools, some basic, others far more tactical. Among them was a compact earpiece radio, a high-powered flashlight, and a few improvised defensive items that only someone with his background would think to carry. It didn't take long for the bikers to show up. The growl of engines echoed in the distance, growing louder as they approached. Jake positioned himself on the high ground, watching as the headlights of nearly a dozen bikes illuminated the site below. They weren't just the same crew from before. Reinforcements had arrived more than Jake had anticipated. Among them was the leader, sitting tall on his Harley, his skull and snake tattoo illuminated in the moonlight. "Come out, old man," the leader bellowed. "We've got unfinished business." Jake didn't respond immediately. Instead, he waited, letting the tension build. The bikers dismounted, spreading out as they searched for him. They were loud, cocky, and overconfident, exactly what Jake was counting on. When he finally revealed himself, it wasn't with words. A powerful beam of light cut through the darkness, blinding the bikers and throwing their disorganized group into chaos. Jake's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "You came looking for me," he said, his tone echoing across the site. "Big mistake." The fight that followed wasn't a brawl, it was a calculated dismantling. Jake moved like a ghost, using the shadows and terrain to his advantage. He struck fast and hard, targeting weak points and disarming the bikers one by one. A chain was yanked from one man's grip and used to trip another. A helmet became an improvised shield, deflecting a crowbar swing before being slammed into its wielder. The bikers tried to gang up on him, but their numbers only made them clumsier, colliding with each other as Jake outmaneuvered them. The leader, realizing his men were being taken down, roared in frustration. "Fight me like a man," he shouted, drawing a knife and stepping forward. Jake emerged from the shadows, his expression cold and unyielding. "You don't want that," he said flatly. But the leader charged anyway. Jake disarmed him in seconds, the knife clattering to the ground as the leader found himself pinned against a concrete pillar. Jake's forearm pressed against his throat, and for the first time, the man looked truly terrified. "You don't get it, do you?" Jake said, his voice low but fierce. "You think you're tough because you run in a pack. But out here, it's just you and me. And you're out of your depth." The leader tried to speak, but Jake didn't let him. Instead, he let go, watching as the man crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. As the bikers lay scattered, groaning, and defeated, one of them managed to gasp out, "Who are you?" Jake paused, standing tall amidst the wreckage. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small medallion, holding it up for all to see. The inscription was simple but carried a weight none of them could deny: Special Forces. Honor. Sacrifice. Valor. "I'm the guy who keeps people like you in check," Jake said. "And if you ever cross this line again, you'll find out just how serious I can get." The bikers didn't argue. They scrambled to their feet, dragging their wounded and retreating as quickly as they could. The leader cast one last glance over his shoulder, fear etched into his face, before disappearing into the night. When the dust settled, Jake stood alone, the silence of the construction site wrapping around him like a blanket. He tucked the medallion back into his jacket, its weight a reminder of the life he'd lived and the code he still followed. He knew this wouldn't be the last time he'd have to defend himself or others. But for now, the battle was over, and justice had been served. Jake mounted his bike, the engine roaring to life as he rode off into the night. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but he faced it with the quiet resolve of a man who had nothing to prove, only a promise to keep. Jake rode into the night, his silhouette blending with the shadows of the empty highway. The wind cooled his face, but his mind remained sharp, scanning his surroundings for any lingering threats. He knew better than to trust a retreat at face value. Men like the ones he had just faced didn't always give up easily. The stars stretched endlessly above him, their light faint against the vast darkness. Jake's grip tightened on the handlebars as flashes of his past came rushing back. The chaos of the ambush, the screams of his comrades, and the weight of decisions no one should ever have to make, they were scars etched not only on his body but in his soul. Each fight, each conflict, was a reminder of who he had been and why he had left that life behind. But leaving wasn't the same as forgetting. And tonight had proven that the soldier within him still lingered. Hours later, Jake pulled into a small motel on the edge of a nameless town. The neon vacancy sign flickered weakly in the darkness. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up as Jake slid cash across the desk and took a key. The room was simple: bed, chair, a lamp that buzzed faintly when switched on. Jake set his bag down and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank wall in front of him. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax, letting the weight of the evening sink in. He leaned back and closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. His mind kept circling back to the bikers, the tracking device, and the reinforcements they'd brought. They had underestimated him once, but if they had connections or worse, someone higher up pulling the strings, they might not make the same mistake twice. Jake opened his bag, pulling out a map, a notebook, and a pen. He began jotting down notes, sketching out the faces of the bikers he'd encountered, and listing every detail he could recall. Patterns. Numbers. Anything that might help him stay ahead of whatever came next. The next morning, Jake woke to the sound of engines once again. Peeking through the blinds, he saw two unfamiliar bikes parked near the motel's entrance. Their riders weren't the same men from the previous night, but their cut-off vests and patches marked them as part of the same gang. Jake cursed under his breath. Word had spread faster than he anticipated. He grabbed his jacket, pocketed his medallion, and left the room as if nothing was amiss. As he approached his bike, the two men stepped forward, blocking his path. One of them, a wiry man with tattoos snaking up his neck, smirked. "You Tanner?" he asked, his voice dripping with false politeness. Jake didn't answer, but his stance shifted ever so slightly, his muscles coiled and ready. The second man, bulkier and holding a chain loosely in his hands, spoke up. "Boss wants a word with you. Said to bring you in. Whole thing can go easy, or not." Jake let out a slow breath. "I'll save you the trouble. Tell your boss I'm not interested." The wiry man laughed. "Yeah, see, that's not how it works." He stepped closer, his smirk turning into a sneer. "You don't get to say no." Before either of them could react, Jake moved. His left hand grabbed the chain mid-swing, yanking it from the larger man's grip while his right elbow connected with the wiry man's jaw. The fight was over before it began. Both men were on the ground, groaning and clutching their injuries. Jake crouched beside them, his voice low and calm. "Go back to your boss. Tell him if he's got something to say, he can come find me himself." "But I'd think twice about that." The wiry man nodded frantically, his earlier bravado gone. Jake stood, mounted his bike, and rode off before anyone else could intervene. Jake didn't stop until he reached another quiet spot, an old diner just off the main road. He ordered a coffee and took a seat by the window, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what was happening. This wasn't just a random gang looking for trouble anymore. The tracking device, the reinforcements, and now these new men, it all pointed to something bigger. As he sipped his coffee, he overheard snippets of conversation from the booth behind him. Two truckers were talking about a local gang causing problems in the area. "Yeah, they've been stirring up trouble all over," one of them said. "Used to just be about running drugs, but lately, they've been pushing into new territory. Heard they're working with some out-of-town crew now." Jake's ears perked up. Out-of-town crew? That could explain the escalation. If this gang had aligned themselves with a larger organization, they might be emboldened enough to come after someone like him. He finished his coffee, left cash on the table, and walked out, his mind already forming a plan. Jake spent the next few hours gathering supplies. A hardware store provided him with some basic tools: zip ties, duct tape, and a crowbar. At a nearby surplus store, he picked up a tactical flashlight, extra gloves, and a compact first aid kit. He didn't know exactly what he'd be facing, but he wasn't about to be caught off guard. By sunset, he was back on the road, heading toward a small industrial area he'd scouted earlier. It was isolated enough to avoid civilian casualties and had plenty of cover if things went south. Jake parked his bike and began setting up, using his surroundings to create a defensive perimeter. He laid out traps, a rope snare here, a makeshift tripwire there. He wasn't taking any chances. As night fell, he settled into his position, his senses sharp and alert. He didn't have to wait long. The sound of multiple engines echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. They were coming. And this time, Jake was ready. The first biker to step into Jake's trap went down hard, his ankle caught in a snare that sent him sprawling to the ground. The others hesitated, their confidence shaken as Jake's voice rang out from the shadows. "You came all this way," he called. "Let's see if you've got what it takes." Chaos erupted. The bikers charged in, their numbers greater than ever, but Jake moved like a force of nature. He used the traps to his advantage, picking them off one by one as confusion spread through their ranks. When the leader finally appeared, flanked by two massive enforcers, Jake stepped forward, his eyes locked on his opponent. This was the man orchestrating it all, the one who had sent the first gang after him, the one who thought he could break Jake. The fight that followed was brutal and unrelenting, but Jake's experience and determination won out. When the dust settled, the leader was on his knees, his men either unconscious or fleeing into the night. Jake stood over the defeated leader, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. "This ends here," he said, his voice firm. "If I hear about you or your crew causing trouble again, I'll come back. And next time, I won't go easy." The leader nodded, too beaten to argue. Jake let him go, watching as he stumbled away into the darkness. For the first time in days, the highway felt quiet. Jake mounted his bike and rode off, the stars above him shining brighter than before. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain: he would always stand against those who preyed on the weak. Because that's who he was. And that's who he'd always be. The clerk stood by the gas station entrance, staring into the distance long after Jake had disappeared. The remnants of the fight were scattered across the dusty parking lot: dented metal, torn leather, and shattered egos. It was the kind of scene that left an imprint, a memory that would stay with the young man for years to come. Inside, the radio played a faint country tune, oblivious to the chaos that had just unfolded. The teenager stepped back inside, glancing nervously at the shattered display rack that bore the brunt of the scuffle. He shook his head in disbelief, still replaying the scene in his mind: the way Jake had moved, the calmness he had exuded, and the absolute control he seemed to have over the situation. "Just a guy passing through," the clerk muttered to himself, a smirk forming on his lips. He knew there was more to Jake Tanner than that, but maybe it was better not to know. Jake didn't look back as he rode. The roar of his bike was the only sound accompanying him on the open road, a steady hum that matched the rhythm of his thoughts. He had left the bikers with bruised bodies and bruised pride, but he wasn't naive enough to think it was over. Men like them didn't take kindly to being humiliated, especially by a lone drifter. But Jake also knew something they didn't: fear is a powerful teacher. He had shown them what it meant to cross the wrong man. If they were smart, they'd think twice before targeting anyone else. If they weren't, well, Jake would deal with that bridge when he came to it. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows across the asphalt. Jake's mind wandered back to the fights he'd faced before, both on and off the battlefield. Each victory came with a price, a weight he carried silently. Justice wasn't always clean, and it wasn't always kind, but it was necessary. By the time Jake reached the next town, night had fully fallen. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional bark of a dog or the distant rumble of a passing truck. He pulled into a small diner, the kind of place with neon signs that flickered and coffee that was always just a little too strong. Jake stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. The waitress behind the counter glanced up, her eyes briefly scanning his worn leather jacket and weathered face before offering a polite smile. "What'll it be?" she asked. "Coffee," Jake replied, taking a seat at the far end of the counter. As the waitress poured the steaming cup, Jake's ears picked up on a conversation from a booth near the back. A group of locals was discussing recent troubles in the area: rising gang activity, theft, and intimidation. It didn't take long for Jake to piece together that the bikers he had faced were part of something larger, a network spreading fear across the region. They've been hitting shops, diners, even a few farms, one of the men said. Cops can't or won't do much about it? Too scared, I guess. Jake sipped his coffee, his mind working as he listened. He hadn't planned on staying in the area, but something about the situation didn't sit right with him. He had seen too much of this kind of fear good people pushed into silence by those who thrived on intimidation. It wasn't just about the bikers anymore, it was about setting things right. The next day, Jake began his quiet investigation. He didn't ask questions outright, instead, he observed. At the gas station, at the diner, even at the local hardware store he picked up fragments of conversations, small details that painted a bigger picture. The gang had a base of operations just outside town, an old warehouse they used as their stronghold. It was where they planned their operations, stored stolen goods, and retreated when things got heated. Jake didn't waste time. He rode to the outskirts of town, parking his bike a safe distance from the warehouse. From a hidden vantage point, he studied the building. It was large, surrounded by chain-link fencing and guarded by a few men who looked as rough as the ones he'd already encountered. Jake noted the patterns of their movements, the placement of their vehicles, and the layout of the surrounding area. It was a fortress for bullies, and Jake intended to tear it down. Under the cover of night, Jake made his move. He slipped through a gap in the fence, moving with the silent precision that had been drilled into him during his years in the military. The guards never saw him coming. One by one, they were incapacitated silently, efficiently. Jake wasn't there to kill, he was there to dismantle their operation and send a message they wouldn't forget. Inside the warehouse, Jake found exactly what he was looking for, evidence of the gang's activities. Stolen goods, detailed plans for their next moves, and even a ledger listing payments and names. It was enough to cripple their operations and expose anyone who had been working with them. Before he left, Jake made sure to leave his mark. Using a can of spray paint, he scrawled a simple message on the wall, "No more." It wasn't flashy, but it was enough. The gang would know who had been there, and they would understand the warning. By the time the gang realized what had happened, Jake was long gone. The locals, however, were quick to notice the change. The bikers who had once roamed the streets freely were nowhere to be seen. Their intimidation tactics ceased, their stolen goods returned quietly to their rightful owners. Word spread quickly, and while no one knew exactly who had been responsible, whispers of a lone figure, a drifter who didn't tolerate injustice, began to circulate. Jake didn't stick around to hear the gratitude. He didn't need it. His reward was knowing that the people in that town could sleep a little easier, free from the fear that had gripped them for so long. As Jake rode into the horizon, the town receded into the distance. He didn't look back, he never did. There were more roads to travel, more wrongs to right, and more people who needed someone to stand up for them. Jake Tanner wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He didn't wear a cape, and he didn't seek recognition. But he understood the importance of fighting for what was right, even when no one was watching. For Jake, justice wasn't just an act, it was a way of life. And as long as there were people like the bikers, preying on the vulnerable, Jake knew his journey was far from over. The open road called, and Jake answered, his bike roaring to life as he disappeared into the vast expanse of the unknown. In the heart of America, where the roads stretch long and the skies seem endless, stories of bravery unfold in the most unexpected ways. Jake Tanner was one of those stories. He didn't fit the typical mold of a hero. He wasn't loud or flashy, and he certainly didn't seek attention. Instead, he moved through life like a whisper, soft but powerful, quietly shifting the balance of right and wrong. The sun dipped low as Jake rode away from the town, the fading light painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He felt a sense of peace wash over him, mixed with the weight of his experiences. Each mile he traveled was a reminder of the challenges he had faced, the battles he had fought not just against physical enemies, but against fear, judgment, and misunderstanding. Many people walk through life unnoticed, just like Jake had before that day at the gas station. Society often overlooks them, quick to judge based on appearances or assumptions. But these quiet souls often hold the most strength. They have stories etched into their skin, scars that speak of survival, and eyes that have seen both beauty and brutality. As Jake thought about the clerk at the gas station, he realized how important it was to set an example for those who felt powerless. The kid had watched in awe, seeing firsthand that one person could make a difference. He would carry that memory with him, shaping his view of the world and reminding him that bravery often comes in unexpected forms. Jake's actions didn't just affect him, they rippled outward, touching the lives of others. The diner patrons began to share stories of their own bravery, recounting times when they stood up against bullies or helped a neighbor in need. In a world that sometimes feels dark, these small acts of courage remind us of the good that exists. Heroes don't always wear capes, but their impact can be monumental. When people hear about Jake's bravery, they might be inspired to act, too. Perhaps someone will find the courage to help a stranger, stand up for a friend, or even confront their own fears. Each act of kindness and strength creates a chain reaction, lighting the way for others. Jake Tanner embodied strength in its truest form. His journey was a testament to the idea that anyone can be a hero. It doesn't matter where you come from or what you look like, what truly matters is the choice to act when the moment calls for it. Heroes are not defined by their pasts but by how they respond to the challenges in front of them. As he rode on, Jake reflected on his own journey. He had faced many battles, some physical, others internal. Each one had shaped him into the man he was today. And while he might not seek recognition, he understood that every fight had meaning. It was about protecting the vulnerable, speaking for the voiceless, and standing up against injustice. In a world so often driven by appearances, Jake reminded us to look deeper. Those who judge by the surface often miss the true essence of a person. The soft-spoken, unassuming individuals may hold the greatest wisdom and strength. We should be cautious about making assumptions, for the person we overlook might be the one who steps up in a time of need. Every day presents a choice, to be a bystander or a participant in the fight for what is right. It's easy to stand by and let others take the lead, but true courage lies in taking a stand, regardless of the risks. Heroes emerge in everyday moments when someone chooses to lend a hand, to stand up for a friend, or to speak out against wrongdoing. Jake's journey was not just about him, it was also about empowerment. Each person he encountered was reminded of their own strength. The clerk, the diner patrons, and even those who had felt the weight of fear began to understand that they, too, could make a difference. In his heart, Jake hoped that they would carry that lesson with them. Maybe they would find the courage to help someone in need or to confront a bully. Maybe they would become the quiet heroes of their own stories, standing up for justice in small ways that could lead to big changes. As the wind whipped through Jake's hair and the road stretched ahead, he knew that he was just one man in a vast world. But he also knew that his actions could leave a mark. Just like ripples in water, a single act of bravery can spread outward, influencing countless others. With every town he visited, he left behind a piece of himself, a message that said, "You are not alone. Stand tall. Fight back." Each person who heard his story could carry that message forward, creating a network of support and courage that transcended fear. Jake Tanner's ride into the horizon symbolized more than just a journey, it was a call to action for everyone watching, listening, and learning. It reminded us that heroes are not always found in movies or books. They live among us, often unnoticed, quietly making a difference. So, as you go about your day, remember that heroism can be as simple as being kind, standing up for someone, or sharing your story. When the moment comes to choose between silence and action, remember Jake Tanner, the quiet hero who showed us that sometimes, The strongest voices are the ones that speak softly. Sometimes, heroes don't wear capes or parade their strength. They're the quiet ones, the ones who step up when it matters most. And for those who judge by appearances, they never see it coming. The world needs more quiet heroes. So be one. You never know who you might inspire.